The fateful night on the Los Angeles freeway. It was supposed to be an ordinary Friday night in the suburbs of Los Angeles. Sarah Nguyen, a 28-year-old woman of Vietnamese descent, had just finished dinner with her husband, Matt, and his family. The Rodriguez home, with its glowing porch lights and laughter spilling out the windows, had always felt like a safe haven. But as the clock neared midnight and the guests began to leave, Sarah felt a strange unease she couldn't place, a tension in the air, heavy and electric. Driving home, Sarah took the wheel at Matt's insistence, as he had had a glass too many. The roads were unusually empty for Los Angeles, the city of endless motion. The dimness of the late hour, the rhythmic flash of streetlights, and the muted hum of the car's engine combined into a hypnotic lull. Matt, sitting beside her, dozed off with his head turned against the window. Sarah's thoughts drifted. Her new life, the challenges of blending cultures, the pressures of being a daughter-in-law in a family that seemed both loving and inscrutable. The quiet was suddenly shattered by a blinding flash of headlights from behind. A black SUV, its windows tinted, swerved aggressively, tailing their sedan much too close. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her heart pounding. She checked her mirrors, attempting to let the car pass, but it clung stubbornly to her rear bumper. Just as she changed lanes to get away, the SUV rammed into their vehicle, sending them spinning across 3 empty lanes before slamming into the guardrail with sickening force. Glass exploded in sparkling confetti. The airbags burst forward, cutting off Sarah's scream. The world became a swirl of metal, smoke, and the squeal of rubber. For a few timeless seconds, all she registered was Matt's limp body beside her, the acrid smell of burning, and the overwhelming certainty that something was terribly, intentionally wrong. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Sarah's vision blurred, and pain radiated from her chest and arms. Disoriented, she caught passing images, flashing red and blue lights, paramedics' voices shouting to hang in there. Matt's blood-soaked shirt, his face ghostly pale. The last thing Sarah saw before her world went black was her purse, contents spilled open, a family photo fluttering onto the asphalt under the freeway signs. Before the night claimed her memories, when she would awaken days later in the hospital, broken and alone, even her own recollection of that harrowing night would feel shrouded in fog, leaving her haunted and desperately searching for answers, accused and stripped of everything. The sterile light of the hospital contrasted cruelly with the warmth of the home Sarah had left behind. Just days after waking from the accident, she was thrust into a new kind of storm. Not one of metal and noise, but of whispers, stares, and cold avoidance. Her body ached, but what hurt more was the chill in the eyes of those she once called family. As she lay in her hospital bed, Sarah waited, believing Matt's family would rush to her side, comfort her, share her pain. But when they arrived, her mother-in-law, her father-in-law, and her sister-in-law, Jenna, their faces were unreadable. Sympathy gave way to stern questions. How fast were you driving? Did you fall asleep at the wheel? Each word pressed a new bruise on Sarah's heart. Quickly, the narrative hardened. Even before the police had finished their investigation, and before Sarah could steady her memories, the family seemed certain the accident was her fault. Hushed conversations drifted through her hospital door. Tales of recklessness, irresponsibility, and why did we ever trust her with Matt's life? It was as if she were already on trial. The verdict decided in whispers behind closed doors. When Matt's condition worsened and long days turned into restless nights, the family's grief twisted into something harsher. The house that once welcomed her became unrecognizable. Sarah was quietly asked not to return, her room packed before she could leave her hospital bed. Financial accounts co-owned for their future were hastily removed from her name. A lawyer was retained by her in-laws, not to help her cope, but to question her judgment, and before long, her intentions. Friends on the periphery fell silent, uncertain whom to believe or support. Invitations vanished. Where once she dined at family barbecues, her place was left conspicuously empty. Sarah watched as photographs of her with Matt disappeared from social media, almost as if she were being erased, pixel by pixel. Worst of all was the loss of trust. Matt's family did not just take away her possessions and her home. They stripped her of her dignity, her reputation, and the very sense of belonging that had made America feel safe.
There it is.
Every dream, every promise, every plan for the future collapsed under the weight of suspicion and accusation. As the weeks dragged by, Sarah found herself completely isolated. The world that had been built over years of effort crumbled overnight by the judgment of people she had tried so hard to love, and who, at the moment she most needed them, turned away. Pain and isolation in the vast American land. The days that followed her discharge from the hospital blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. For Sarah Nguyen, the city of Los Angeles, once teeming, vibrant, full of promise, now felt as vast and empty as a desert highway at night. The hum of traffic, the neon lights, even the distant laughter she sometimes heard drifting up from the street below her small apartment, now carried a sharp edge of loneliness. Each morning, Sarah awoke to a silence that pressed so heavily on her chest, it felt almost physical. She'd never lived alone before. The apartment, rented hastily and furnished only with the bare minimum, echoed with every movement. Her suitcase remained in the hallway, half unpacked, as if her body refused to admit that this exile might be permanent. She tried to fill her days with small rituals, making coffee, washing dishes, watering the tiny succulent Matt had once bought her at a farmer's market. But each act felt hollow, a token attempt at normalcy in a world that had utterly changed. She caught herself talking to Matt's absence, apologizing aloud for things she could not remember, bargaining with a silence that never answered. Sarah's body healed in slow degrees. The bruises faded, the stitches dissolved, but the ache inside her grew sharper. Sometimes the pain would surprise her, sudden and electric, triggered by a memory. Matt's laugh at the breakfast table, the feel of his hand on hers, a song played in the elevator she once loved. At night, she lay awake, tracing the glow of car headlights across the ceiling, every sound amplified by darkness. Isolation in America was not just social, but cultural, a deeper quiet that came from feeling unanchored in a place that no longer seemed to want her. Her accent, her name, her skin, all the things Matt had once cherished about her, now seemed to set her apart. At the grocery store, she avoided eye contact, afraid someone might recognize her from the news or neighborhood gossip. A once supportive group of church acquaintances offered only terse condolences when she reached out, and then nothing. She began to dread the ring of her phone, certain it was never good news. She scrolled through social media, watching the lives of others move on. Former friends posted pictures from backyard barbecues, beach trips, and sunny brunches. Matt's family seemed to close ranks, erasing every trace of her from their timelines. It was as if a whole history had been rewritten overnight, and Sarah was no longer part of the narrative. Even old university friends, scattered across the country, sent only obligatory messages, Thinking of you. Hope you're okay. Conversations that quickly faded into silence. Her own family, thousands of miles away in Vietnam, called often at first, voices laden with worry and guilt. But the time difference and Sarah's reluctance to share the worst of her pain left gaps between calls that grew wider. How could she tell her parents that America, the place of so many dreams and sacrifices, now felt cold and hollow? How could she explain the particular ache of being a stranger, not only in a foreign country, but in what was supposed to be her own home, her own marriage? To the world outside, Los Angeles was glamorous, a city that sparkled under the sun and never slept. To Sarah, it became a city of shadows and contradictions. She wandered the streets without purpose, losing hours in anonymous crowds. Some nights, she found herself walking without direction through the expanse of Griffith Park, standing alone on a hilltop to watch the city sprawl out below, lights twinkling in a grid that only underscored how small and lost she felt. She tried to reach out once to a support group for trauma survivors, but left after only one session. The stories were heavy, but everyone seemed to have someone in their corner. A mother, a friend, a partner to hold their hand while they spoke. Sarah envied them this simple comfort more than she could admit. The idea of building new friendships, of trusting strangers with the fragile pieces of her heart, felt not only impossible, but dangerous. Who would believe her story, anyway? The nights were hardest. Sleep came in fitful bursts, chased away by nightmares she could barely remember upon waking. Sometimes, she found herself standing at the window in the small hours, staring out across the cityscape, wondering if Matt ever did the same from wherever he now was. The ache for him mingled with fury and guilt. Why had she survived while he lay fighting for his life? Was she truly to blame, as everyone claimed? The questions circled endlessly, offering no relief. Money, too, became a concern. With access to joint accounts cut overnight, Sarah relied on meager personal savings and a small disability check. She counted every dollar, slashing through the simple luxuries that had made hardship bearable. A good meal, a new book, a treat from the neighborhood bakery. She took odd jobs online, freelance work that paid little, but filled some of the hours. Still, each email from her landlord or overdue bill brought a fresh spike of dread. There were moments when hope flickered. A kind nurse at the hospital who slipped her an extra meal, a neighbor who left a basket of fruit, and a silent note at her door. Each gesture was precious, a promise that the world was not entirely without kindness, but none of it could fill the ache left by Matt's family, by friends who had vanished, by a future that seemed to shrink the longer she stared into it. Sometimes, Sarah wondered if the city itself was testing her, setting her afloat in a sea of millions, only to see if she could find her way back to shore.
Wait a minute.
She envied the tourists she saw at the pier, their eyes wide with wonder, the newness of the city palpable on their faces. For her, everything was tinged with memory, with loss. Slowly, though, amidst the isolation, a kind of resilience began to take root. Sarah did not realize it at first. The process was almost invisible, a silent, stubborn seed pushing through concrete. She found a kind of strange comfort in routine, in surviving one lonely day, then the next. She kept a journal, filling it with letters to Matt and to her past self, trying to map the path that had led her here. On some days, rage fueled her at the injustice, at the cruel ease with which she'd been discarded. On other days, the simple act of getting dressed or making her bed felt like a triumph. The reflection in the mirror changed too. At first, she saw only loss, swollen eyes, fading bruises, hair grown limp. But gradually, she noticed strength too. The set of her jaw, the steadiness in her gaze. The city no longer swallowed her whole. Instead, she learned to move through it with a cautious grace, invisible when she needed to be, attentive to the subtle cues of kindness or indifference. Sarah's loneliness, though excruciating, became both a prison and a crucible, testing what she was made of, shaping the edges of her grief into something harder, sharper. She learned to apologize less for her presence, to stop flinching at her own shadow. When she caught sight of couples sharing coffee or families laughing together, the pang of envy was still sharp, but somehow lessened by the certainty that she had chosen survival, day after bitter day. In those long months, the world narrowed to what Sarah could carry: a borrowed teapot, a single photo of Matt tucked inside a battered wallet, the keys to a home that was hers alone. For now, she did not know if she would ever truly belong again. Not to this city, not to another family. But slowly, the ache in her chest became manageable. Pain became background noise, a dull companion rather than an overwhelming force. Ultimately, it was in the silence of her small apartment, on long walks through city streets, in the lonely act of breathing through another sleepless night, that Sarah discovered a strength she had never imagined needing. The cruelty of abandonment carved out a space for her to ask new questions. Not just how she would go on, but who she wanted to be when she did. And somewhere in that void, the faintest flicker of resolve survived. To seek the truth, to reclaim her story, and, above all, to refuse to let the coldness of America or the betrayal of those she once trusted define her. Suspicion, in the determination to find the truth time, had become a curious enemy for Sarah Nguyen. In the drifting months after her exile, the heavy silence and routine of loneliness gave her mind space to circle the events of the accident endlessly. At first, she tried to stifle suspicion, telling herself it was nothing but the wounded paranoia of the unjustly accused. But the more she recalled, each fragment of memory slowly sharpening in her solitary hours, the more something gnawed at her. Details refused to settle smoothly into place. The world, she realized, was holding a secret, and it was time she uncovered it. It began, as most suspicions do, with a single offhand remark on a rare call with Jenna, a conversation meant to be about Matt's ongoing recovery. The older woman had slipped, mentioning a street name that didn't fit with the official police account. Later, Sarah tried to brush it off, but the comment clashed with everything she remembered from the night of the crash: the route, the detour, the time they left the dinner party. She started making lists: places, times, faces, mapping out her recollections in the margins of her battered journal. Sarah replayed that last family dinner over and over in her mind. She'd sat next to Matt, but across from Jenna. Jenna, always dazzling in her ability to make everyone comfortable, had seemed a bit distracted that night, her phone buzzing quietly under the table, her eyes drifting to the window when she thought no one noticed. The memory struck Sarah as odd. Why hadn't she seen it before? Was it just her mind inventing patterns, eager to blame someone else? Or was there something more? For weeks, Sarah scoured her memories for irregularities. The tone in Jenna's voice as she'd hugged goodbye, the knowledge that Jenna had insisted Matt let Sarah drive home, the unfinished glass of wine Jenna barely touched. Even more peculiar, after the accident, Jenna was suddenly less present in Sarah's life. No gestures of support, nor offers of help when Sarah was forced from the family's home. When they did interact, Jenna was guarded, almost rehearsed, in her concern. Small, unsettling things began to add up. There was the matter of the bank accounts. Joint accounts that had required both Matt and Sarah's signatures were somehow emptied within a day of the accident. An impossibility unless someone with inside information had made the call. Sarah remembered Matt mentioning, just days before, how Jenna worked at the local bank's branch office and had offered to help with any paperwork. It felt like a meaningless favor at the time, but under this new light, it shimmered with ominous potential. Alone in her apartment on sleepless nights, Sarah pulled up old emails, texts, and social media posts, the digital detritus of her married life. She noticed in hindsight how often Jenna managed to position herself as a helper, a confidant, even an advisor in delicate matters. She saw it now for what it was, Jenna's intricate weaving of herself into every element of Sarah and Matt's life, always with a smile, always with plausible deniability. Still, suspicion was not enough. Sarah wanted proof. She began tracing timelines and phone calls, reconstructing the hours before and after the accident. Her hands trembled as she dialed the police for a copy of the report, her voice steadying out of sheer will. There were discrepancies. The initial time of 911 call, the angle of impact that didn't match the supposed accident narrative, the missing camera footage from a city intersection that should have captured everything. One afternoon, Sarah visited the site of the crash on the freeway. She stood under the pulsing roar of traffic, tracing her steps. She found, tucked in a tangle of weeds, a scrap of paper she recognized, a receipt from the restaurant they'd eaten at that night, stamped with a time that contradicted Jenna's statements. Sarah photographed it, feeling the first surge of something like hope since her world had collapsed. She reached out to Matt's friends, quietly prodding for information. Most were reluctant, wary of getting involved in family drama. But one old, college buddy agreed to meet. Over burnt diner coffee, he shared two startling details. First, that Matt had confided in him about family tensions, particularly over money. Second, that he'd seen Jenna arguing with someone on the phone outside the party that night. Not her husband, but someone she was giving orders to. With each revelation, the shadows around Jenna's role grew darker. Sarah's drive intensified. She spent her evenings combing through public records, property deeds, phone bills, anything connected to Jenna. She found a string of recent insurance policy changes, all neatly coordinated in the weeks before the accident, naming Jenna as the primary emergency contact instead of Matt. She tracked call logs, finding late-night calls between Jenna and Matt's insurance provider, made from her work office. Sarah's skin tingled with the sense that the world was about to upend itself again. The more she learned, the less afraid she felt. Fear was replaced by a hard, bright determination. She recalled every cold glance, every veiled accusation, every moment she had been cast out so easily. If she was the villain of their story, she would at least reclaim the narrative, not to exonerate herself, but to find the truth, no matter the cost. But it was more than facts and figures. The suspicion began to chip away at Sarah's lingering self-doubt, turning her grief into resolve. No longer content to accept others' explanations for her own life, she mapped out her investigation with military precision. She set reminders on her phone for follow-ups, drafted scripts for difficult phone calls, and forced herself to pursue every angle, no matter how uncomfortable. Each day was a step, however small, out from the paralysis of grief and into the unsteady confidence of action. Sarah sought out the old family lawyer, hoping for sympathy, but encountered only warnings. Be careful, Sarah. The truth has a way of making enemies. Still, she pressed on. Her world, once ruled by fear and isolation, now spun on the unfamiliar but empowering axis of truth-seeking. She started leaving copies of every discovery with a trusted friend, in case anything happened to her. She documented everything, creating a living record of her journey out of the shadows. Occasionally, doubt still gripped her. She questioned her sanity on long drives through the city, wondered if her pain had simply invented a villain so her heart could rest. But each new detail, each hint of deception or omitted truth, kept her focused on the path ahead. The need for answers eclipsed her fear of further loss. Most of all, Sarah refused to let those who had turned their backs define her. If Matt's family whispered about her behind closed doors, let them. If old friends had vanished, so be it. She had been erased, but she would write herself back in. This time, not as a victim, but as a seeker of truth. On the eve of her 31st birthday, Sarah looked at her, reflection, and hardly recognized herself. The same woman, and yet not. The pain was still there, but no longer the whole story. There was something new etched across her features. The determined spark of someone who would not look away, not from the truth, and not from what she, at last, was becoming. She was ready, not for revenge, but for reckoning. And as the city's lights flickered far below, Sarah promised herself she would uncover what really happened on that fateful night, even if the answer shattered everything she had left. The silent investigation begins, with her suspicions sharpened and a new resolve simmering beneath her grief. Sarah Nguyen moved into a phase of quiet but determined action, having never imagined herself as someone who would snoop, question, or operate in secrecy. She found herself, nonetheless, propelled by an inner necessity. She knew that if she waited for someone else to vindicate her, the truth might disappear forever. In America's crowded avenues and anonymous spaces, she would become her own detective. She started simply, understanding that even the smallest inconsistency could unravel an entire story. Her first step was to create a safe repository, both digital and physical, where she could record findings without fear of interference. She bought a small fireproof lockbox and designated a secret folder on a password-protected hard drive. Each day, almost ritualistically, she uploaded screenshots, save files, and summaries, feeling a fragile sense of control return with every act of documentation. Her methods grew more sophisticated. Knowing that Jenna worked at the bank, Sarah requested her own bank statements and pored over them for anomalies. She noticed several transactions the day after the accident, account closures, wire transfers, legal fees that should have required her signature, but evidently did not. She flagged these, printed the pages, and slipped them into her folder. Sarah then began tracking timelines. She drew out meticulous diagrams in her notebook, cross-referencing family text messages, Matt's call logs, and the hours noted in police and ambulance reports. A pattern emerged. Jenna's timeline had unexplained gaps that coincided suspiciously with critical financial and logistical changes. But coincidences were not enough for proof. Sarah needed hard evidence. It took courage to reach out for help. She contacted a friend from an old volunteer program, an IT specialist now working in digital forensics. Framing her request as help for a family legal matter, Sarah asked whether it was possible to retrieve deleted emails or recover metadata from a shared computer in the Rodriguez household. Her friend agreed to walk her through the basics of data recovery. Nervous but determined, Sarah scheduled visits to the family's residence under the guise of checking on Matt's belongings. Using a portable USB stick, she discreetly scanned and copied old files from the family computer during her brief, tense visits, each moment brimming with the anxiety of discovery. Surveillance became part of Sarah's routine. She started visiting the scene of the crash every few days, observing how the city's security cameras operated at various hours. She mapped which stores and gas stations along the route maintained footage for the longest periods. Knowing that time was her enemy, most businesses deleted old footage after 30 days. She made polite but insistent requests, at times feigning worry about a lost dog. To avoid arousing suspicion, she managed to collect several clips, one showing Jenna's car tailing them earlier that night, another capturing the black SUV circling a nearby intersection before the crash. When examining these videos, Sarah wished she had expert eyes. One night, frustration threatening to overwhelm her, she posted anonymously in an online forum for true crime enthusiasts. She uploaded stills, distorted the faces for privacy, and asked if anyone could enhance the plates or glean details missed. To her amazement, within hours, someone responded with software suggestions, and another user highlighted a partial license plate in the corner of a blurry frame. It wasn't a breakthrough yet, but it was a spark. Looking for motive, Sarah quietly contacted an acquaintance who managed insurance policies at a local brokerage. Speaking in hushed tones in a back booth at a nearly deserted diner, she asked questions about life insurance, medical claims, emergency contacts, and recent changes to beneficiary designations in the Rodriguez family. Bit by bit, the acquaintance confirmed a troubling pattern. Changes made to Matt's policy within days of the accident. Jenna's name featured centrally, and signatures that, on close inspection, didn't quite match Matt's handwriting. Sarah asked if she could get copies, even unofficially, and received a cautious nod. 2 days later, papers arrived in a plain manila envelope, slipped under Sarah's apartment door. Still, there was the matter of witnesses. Sarah scoured social media for people who were at the Rodriguez house on the night of the family dinner. She sent out hesitant, coded messages. Do you remember who left first? Did you notice anything odd about the cars parked outside? Most replies were vague or evasive, but one neighbor recalled a heated conversation between Jenna and a man who did not appear to be her husband. Another mentioned seeing Jenna at a nearby gas station late that night, looking flustered while she made a call. Sarah documented these anecdotes carefully, aware that one person's stray memory might connect the final dots. Keeping her investigation secret proved incredibly lonely. Sarah longed to share her discoveries with someone, anyone, but she feared leaks, disbelief, or consequences for those she might trust. Still, the process changed her. She grew less hesitant. When Jenna called with feigned concern, Sarah responded calmly, masking her own suspicions and carefully steering the conversation to probe for more information. Her confidence grew as her evidence coalesced. She began assembling a dossier so detailed: bank records, text chains, insurance documents, video footage, witness accounts, that even the most skeptical observer would be forced to pay attention. She drafted a concise narrative, imagining herself presenting it to investigators or a future lawyer. Each fact was cross-checked, time-stamped, and contextualized, with gaps and questions highlighted for deeper digging. It was painstaking work, but it was hers, and it gave her purpose. Amid this effort, Sarah was forced to become resourceful. When an unexpected bill threatened to eat into her meager savings, she picked up last-minute work as a temp assistant at a legal office downtown. There, she quietly observed how real investigators interviewed clients, preserved evidence, and prepared cases for trial. She watched, learned, and adjusted her approach. Sometimes, she even practiced her own story in the bathroom mirror, just to discipline her voice for the day she'd need to speak her truth. Paranoia lingered at the edge of her thoughts. She checked locks twice, varied her routes home, and left a backup dossier with a trusted friend, just in case. But these actions no longer felt cowardly. They were smart, the product of a woman who refused to be erased by fear or by the easy answers others wanted to believe. Through it all, Sarah never lost sight of the reason she was doing this. Not revenge, but the restoration of her dignity, her innocence, and a future that was truly hers. With each sleepless night, she grew more certain secrets never stayed buried forever, and when the time came, she would be ready to bring them into the light. In the end, the silent investigation was more than a search for evidence. It was an act of reclamation in a city that had stripped her of identity, community, and belonging. Sarah rebuilt herself, piece by piece, with every document slipped into her folder, every camera frame recovered, every truth wrested from the shadows. And when the day for confrontation finally arrived, she would not stand alone or empty-handed. She would stand as someone who had turned isolation into action, suspicion into clarity, and pain into proof. Unmasking the mastermind. The day Sarah Nguyen decided to unmask the person who had orchestrated her suffering, Los Angeles was just beginning to shed the cool morning fog. Her apartment, long a cramped haven, filled with evidence folders and memories, felt strangely empty now that the final step was at hand. After months of sleepless nights and silent battles, Sarah had amassed proof strong enough to demand answers. No more hiding, no more waiting for justice to come on its own. She knew the truth would shatter more than a few illusions, but it was time for light to pierce darkness. A family gathering provided the perfect setting for her confrontation. The Rodriguez family had reassembled under the guise of supporting Matt's ongoing recovery. The old home was alive with familiar sounds, footsteps on the hardwood, clinks of cutlery, muffled laughter from other rooms. Except, this time, Sarah's presence was met with stiff smiles and wary glances. She walked tall, shoulders squared by the weight of what she knew rather than shame or fear. Jenna was there, charismatic as always, shepherding relatives from kitchen to living room. Her voice, bright and pitched just so. To the untrained eye, she was the pillar who kept the fractured family from falling apart. Only Sarah saw the flicker of tension in her sister-in-law's jaw. Waiting for the moment required patience. Sarah watched as plates were cleared and coffee poured, as small talk turned to tired laments about the changing world. Then, as the evening waned and the crowd shrank to immediate family, Matt's parents, Jenna, and a couple of cousins, Sarah rose to her feet, folder in hand. She felt eyes fix on her, a collective holding of breath. She spoke simply, letting years of being ignored translate into a calm, unshakable voice. I have something to say, and I need everyone's attention. It concerns what happened to Matt and to me that night on the highway. At the mention, a dozen raw nerves bristled in the room. Jenna's mug froze halfway to her lips. Sarah laid out her journey, piece by piece, the way she'd practiced for so many nights. She began with the financial oddities, passing copies of the bank transactions around the table. These transfers occurred within hours of the accident. Without my consent or Matt's, she moved to the insurance documents, each annotated with changes in handwriting and Jenna's name as emergency contact. Then came the video stills, Jenna's car trailing them down the darkened freeway, the mysterious black SUV looping at intersections moments before the crash. Silence clung to the room, thick and stifling, as relatives pored over the evidence. Someone whispered, "This can't be real," but Sarah pressed on. "Here's a copy of the restaurant receipt. It doesn't match Jenna's claim about when we left the dinner party. Here are text messages between her and Matt's insurance agent on the same night." Jenna's mask cracked at the edges. She scoffed, accused Sarah of paranoia. But even as her voice shot up, the tremor in her hands betrayed her. Matt, still recovering but lucid at last, looked from his wife's face to his sister's and back, confusion and dawning horror warring in his eyes. Sarah's voice dropped, resolute. "Jenna, all these threads lead back to you. Every action, every call, every change happened either by your hand or at your request. You emptied our accounts. You changed policies. You were there on the road before the accident. Don't deny it. I have proof." Her words were a scalpel, each precise, measured. Jenna, cornered and exposed, reached for indignation, but found no foothold as more pieces fell into place. Matt's parents looked shattered. For so long, their suspicion had cemented around Sarah, comforted by neat narratives that blamed the outsider rather than one of their own. Now, faced with hard evidence, denial buckled into uncertainty, then began to tip toward guilt. Jenna tried to defend herself. "You're twisting everything. I was just helping. You can't prove what you think." But Sarah took out the final document, an email Jenna had accidentally forwarded, containing instructions to erase security footage and mislead authorities about the timeline. The message that once might have been Sarah's downfall became the key to Jenna's undoing. The room erupted, first with gasps, then with heated voices. Cousins demanded explanations. Matt's mother began to sob, her faith in her daughter unraveling into devastation. Jenna, her face drained of color, tried to leave, but two aunts blocked the door, demanding honesty. Here, at last, was the reckoning Sarah had longed for, not out of revenge, but of necessity. With the truth unveiled, the weight of collective denial dissolved. Matt, speechless, took Sarah's hand, a silent apology radiating from his touch. For Sarah, vindication wasn't sweet vengeance. It was bitter, cathartic, and complicated. She did not relish Jenna's downfall. Instead, she felt only sorrow for what might have been avoided if trust had not been weaponized against her. As calls were placed, to lawyers, to authorities, Sarah's strength became apparent, not as something born of anger, but of endurance. She answered each question calmly, leaving no room for further doubt. The family's apologies, once tinged with suspicion, now came from a humbler place. It would take time to heal these wounds, if they ever could. Later, alone on the porch, Sarah watched a new dawn bloom over Los Angeles. The city looked different, as if her suffering and her courage had carved out a new place for her within it. She understood that in unmasking Jenna, she had salvaged not just her name, but her capacity to trust her own truth. The scars would remain, but not as a reminder of defeat, instead, as proof that she had survived and refused to be rewritten out of her own story. In the thick silence after the storm, Sarah realized that true justice wasn't victory over her betrayer, but the return of her agency. And as the family inside grappled with the fallout, she felt, for the first time in ages, that the next chapters were hers to decide. The coldness of retaliation and personal justice. In the weeks following the confrontation, a new, almost glacial composure settled over Sarah Nguyen. Vindication at the family gathering had not brought catharsis. Instead, it left in its wake a stillness edged with something hard and implacable. The warmth that had once defined her willingness to forgive, to mend, to hope, was shuttered away. If the Rodriguez family expected reconciliation, they waited in vain. Sarah did not choose forgiveness. She attended each legal proceeding with an icy formality, speaking only when necessary, never once meeting Jenna's eyes. The memories of her own isolation, hospital corners, empty texts, the echo of accusatory voices, ran through her veins like cold fire. Any obligation she had once felt toward Matt's family had evaporated, replaced with a steady, passionless resolve. She would not consent to their closure or redemption at the price of her own story. Her manner, once deferential and gentle, became brisk, professional, and unexpectedly intimidating. She answered reporters' questions in crisp, measured tones, declining interviews that sought a human interest angle or the narrative of a triumphant underdog forgiving her enemies. Headlines speculated about her silence. Some in the community, people who had once whispered about her guilt, were unnerved by her refusal to play the part of the gentle victim. Jenna, meanwhile, faced a very public reckoning. The evidence Sarah had so meticulously gathered led to formal charges: fraud, conspiracy, endangerment. As lawyers cycled in and out of hearings, Jenna's bright veneer evaporated, her anger giving way to desperate, public pleas for understanding. She reached out through intermediaries, hoping Sarah would acknowledge her with some gesture of sympathy or mercy. Sarah responded only through attorneys, detached, efficient, and utterly unyielding. Within the Rodriguez family, blame fractured into open rifts. Matt's parents, hollow-eyed with regret, confronted the creditors, dealt with the damage to their reputation, and tried, awkwardly, to reconnect with Sarah. They invited her to dinners and sent long, apologetic letters that never once addressed the substance of their betrayal. Sarah read them, set them aside, and resolved never to return to the home where her dignity had been stripped without hesitation. For a time, Sarah's solitude took on a sharp, cleansing edge. No one could wound her now. Her boundaries were clear, her intentions matter of fact. She sold or donated what remained of her shared life with Matt, moving to a smaller, quieter apartment at the edge of the city. She changed her phone number, closed old accounts, left no forwarding address or trail by which the Rodriguezes might reach her without need. Yet the coldness of Sarah's retaliation was not vengeance for its own sake. It was armor. In America, she had learned, forgiveness offered to those who had not earned it was simply a way to erase pain. She would not participate in her own erasure again. There was justice in her silence, a quiet rebuke to those who had once erased, doubted, and turned away from her. The outside world reacted with fascination and unease. Community groups that once avoided her now awkwardly attempted outreach, donations, meal, invitations, small gestures to soften their collective guilt. Sarah accepted nothing. She maintained her distance from the support groups and circles where whispers lingered, focusing instead on reconstructing herself beyond the shadow of the case. She took long walks in city parks, spent evenings reading, and slowly rebuilt a life where her past did not follow her into every conversation. There were nights when the coldness frightened her, a sudden recognition of how her pain had changed her, how it had drawn sharp borders around her heart. She wondered if she had gone too far, if not forgiving meant giving up a tenderness she feared she might never get back. But then she remembered the callousness with which she'd been cast aside, The bank accounts closed in her hospital bed. The hostile lawyers, the way Jenna's betrayal had never been suspected by those so quick to judge an outsider. In the ledger of her own justice, Sarah saw no debt left unpaid. Matt, still recovering, had tried to bridge the gap between them. He offered apologies, tentative requests for conversation, and once sent her a note simply reading, "I'm sorry for everything. I wish I had been stronger." Sarah did not reply. She understood that some distances, once established, are not cruelty, but self-preservation. A quiet verdict that needed no explanation. Her life was her own to inhabit, now and ever. Sarah's story became a cautionary tale, whispered in the community. Some admired her tenacity. Others feared her resolve. Young women approached her in grocery store aisles, asking quietly how she had survived such abandonment and betrayal. Sarah always answered honestly, "You don't survive by forgiving people who never saw you. You survive by knowing what you're worth, even if no one else does." It was not bitter, merely fact. If she had sought revenge, it would have dwindled into something petty and unsatisfying. Instead, Sarah's icy withdrawal left a legacy of discomfort, a space for the Rodriguezes to reckon with what they'd done, and for others to question how easily innocence can be traded for suspicion. The lesson was not that betrayal demands anger, but that justice requires boundaries, unmoved by the expectations of others. As the legal process ran its course, journalists lost interest, and Sarah found herself at peace with the life she had built from the rubble. She began volunteering quietly at a literacy center, tutoring immigrants who, like her, were finding their way through an unfamiliar world. Her coldness had become something else, not a wall, but a glass shield. Transparent, honest, allowing only those worthy to step inside. On her first birthday, after the ordeal, Sarah made a simple ritual. She lit a single candle and sat quietly, reflecting on the year that had been lost and the resolve that would carry her forward. There was no longing for her former life, no hope to return to what cannot be repaired. There was simply the reality of self-respect, of justice, found in refusing to diminish her experience for anyone's comfort. Sarah knew that some wounds do not close. Some betrayals are not meant to be forgiven. In the end, her coldness was not cruelty, but clarity. Justice, as she learned, was not always about punishment, but about ensuring that what was sacred in herself could never be violated again. And, in the private warmth of her new existence, Sarah discovered that even in the cold, there is a purity, a truth that no one can take away.